ISO versus COSO and those standards. Although I have to say, guys, in the last conversation, we started getting into really more fundamental issues around risk management, compliance, audit, and the like. And I suspect, based on our discussion after the last part of this great debate, that we'll probably be getting into more of those topics as well. So we might still be debating, but it might no longer be a debate about two standards necessarily. So I have with me today the same cast of characters from last time. We have Norman Marks, Tim Leach, and Alex Sidorenko, who will be joining me today. Guys, welcome.
Thank you, Tim.
Thanks, Scott.
Great. Well, listen, I thought I would just kick things off. We in our last conversation, we sort of ended and we were talking a little bit about how really both standards start talking a little bit about things like risk registers or some equivalent. And there was quite a lot of debate on whether or not they were good or bad. I'm pretty sure I even took a little bit of a playing devil's advocate and saying that they were good. But it does sort of just get into this idea. I think everybody agreed that all of us, whether we're in a risk role, compliance role, internal audit, information security, that we ideally want to start transitioning from just managing a list of risks into higher quality decision making. And I know, Alex, this has been on LinkedIn. I mean, you just have a torrent of comments and articles now about decision making. And I thought I'd sort of toss that to you about your point of view on, the fundamental nature of risk management being more about decision making versus being, strictly speaking, managing risk.
Thanks, Scott. And it's a very loaded question. I think the risk management is still going to be both. And just for the sake of simplicity, at least in my mind, to not go crazy, I always call it risk management 1 and risk management 2. Risk management 1 being everything that the shareholders, stakeholders, regulators, insurance companies, credit rating agencies, banks, and all the external stakeholders kind of expect to see. And because they're so far behind in their expectations, it's quite unlikely that they will start asking those real kind of decision-based risk questions anytime soon. So there's probably still going to be that pocket of risk management with the heat maps and the risk registers, risk appetite statements, frameworks, and everything else that just should be there because somebody wants to see it. It's probably not going to generate a lot of value for the company, except getting on the right foot with the stakeholders, maybe getting some discounts on insurance and better premiums and better conversations with the credit rating agencies. But it's probably not going to go away anytime soon. And then the risk management 2 is basically risk management for ourselves, for the decision makers. And I think this is where the biggest paradox is, that is actually not about risk management per se, because to find out what risk management 2 is all about, you need to look at decision quality textbooks from the 70s, statistical textbooks from the 60s, corporate finance books from the 80s, and everything else to do with analyzing decisions and how decisions are made, which has actually been around for years. So in fact, once we kind of say that risk management is maybe moving towards decision making, then we kind of have to appreciate, at least I think we have to appreciate that decision making has been happening for 50 years at least. And there's pretty much zero probability risk managers are going to come up with something amazing that will overshadow all the theory and practice and tools and applications that decision makers have been using for years. And in fact, at the moment, the most advanced scenario analysis, decision trees, and Monte Carlo simulations that risk managers are using have been used by the decision makers since the 70s, or some of the decision makers since the 50s, which is, many years. So I think we're kind of in a very interesting spot where risk management is kind of evolving into the decision-making space, and both ISO and COSO ERM claim that. They're very explicit that risk management should move closer towards strategic planning, decision-making, and performance management. They're very explicit on that. However, it seems like we're on the verge of yet another embarrassment, maybe, because instead of going back to the textbooks of the decision makers that have existed for years, risk managers are beginning to recreate the wheel. Once again, pretending that they can come up with something better that, Stanford professors did in the 70s.
That's interesting. What do you think of that, Norman? Sort of the risk management 1 and 2, and then that last thing Alex was talking about, which is, if this doesn't sound, I don't want to put words in your mouth, Alex, but it's almost, if in risk management 2, nothing new is under the sun, then what should the risk manager be doing?
If anything at all. So Alex and I spent some number of miles walking around Moscow talking about risk management and its failures. And I'm going to return to some of my themes there, which is that we should stop talking about risk. We should instead return to something which is even older than 50 years, although I can't personally attest to having seen it more than 50 years ago. But it's really just intelligent management. What are we trying to do in any organization? We're trying to create value. We're trying to make money in many cases. We're trying to deliver services. And we need to be thinking about what might happen, where we are, and what might happen if we do nothing, and what might happen if we take these kind of steps. Now, those are decisions. And intelligent decision-making has been happening for many, many years, well before anybody started talking about risk or risk management. And does that mean that they were poor decisions and the companies were not being run well? Well, of course they were. Now, could they have been run better in some cases? I think so. I do agree with Alex that the third parties, the stakeholders, the regulators, in some cases auditors, external auditors, are looking for this list of risks, and we can do something to keep them happy. It's got to be better than we have been doing, and the SEC in the US has been trying to get organizations to disclose more about what they're worrying about, rather than this voluminous list of things that might happen. But I think, so there is that risk management 1, but what is risk management 2, and should it be called risk management at all? I had an interesting exchange on a post that I wrote on my blog over the last week when I was talking about who should be looking at emerging risks, which is really things that might happen which we hadn't recognized in the past as being possible, or perhaps we haven't recognized their significance in the past. And I said this really should be management. And somebody came back and said, well, management should be doing it. And if management isn't doing it as part of their normal job, understanding what might happen, thinking about its consequences, thinking about how it might affect the achievement of objectives. And that's what we really should be focusing on. But there is a role for people in risk, what we would now call risk practitioners, to, in some cases, for some decisions, applying some of these tools and techniques that Alex just referenced, such as Monte Carlo and simulation and role-playing and all that kind of stuff, workshops, to provide more input. But let's also recognize that decisions are being made, including what objectives are we going to set, what strategies are we going to deploy to achieve those objectives? Are we on track, and what are we going to do about it? Decisions are being made almost every minute of every day across the extended enterprise. And we can't expect every decision to have to slow down, to have some discipline applied to it. We do need to have certain ones where there is more critical need for thought and analysis to be supported with some of these tools. But I think it really should come down, and I'm going on a lot, I know, Scott, here, but it really should be thinking about what are we trying to achieve as an organization? What are our objectives? Have we set them properly? Are we on track? What are we doing about them? And how can those people in risk management help the organization make those decisions which are going to help the organization succeed? It's not about risk. It's really about thinking about what might happen and how can we help the organization succeed, not just avoid stepping on banana skins and falling down manholes, which is what the list of risks is all about. So I think we should discard the concept of risk and instead focusing on helping people navigate what lies ahead.
What do you think, Tim? Should we discard the word risk from our lexicon altogether?
Well, I understand the point, and you certainly want to make it as simple as you can. I often, when I'm talking to groups, will talk about what we're really here is we're going to add some structured rigor to increase the certainty you'll get what you want and you won't get what you don't want. And one of the key things that Alex brought up was this notion of risk management 1 and 2, 1 being just to pacify regulators. I think that's a fair criticism. I do believe that the regulators sometimes have forced risk and internal audit into roles that are pigeonholed at best, and I think suboptimal in many cases because of the way the regulators envision it. The regulators unequivocally are interested only in a very narrow subset of an entity's business, meaning reliable financial statements, cybersecurity, fraud prevention, crime. So the regulators see themselves, and in the banking sector, heavy focus on solvency because there's a societal impact of insolvency in financial institutions. So the regulators bring a certain mindset. I've been trying very hard to influence the regulators. The FRC, I think, in the UK has at least more verbal support that part of the role of a regulator should be to help companies drive value and create economic prosperity for nations. I'd like to see a lot more out of that in the U.S. I don't see a lot of that in the regulators' mindsets. I'd like to see, because I think it would help balance the role of auditors. Auditors in particular, Sarbanes-Oxley drove them into just an awful role in many companies where, they're focused on testing and things that are not value added, that there are far better ways to accomplish them. But on a bigger role, I believe the future of the risk profession, and I use that in the sense of both internal audit and risk, because if internal audit doesn't think they're about helping manage risk, they need some serious re-education. I believe the goal is to move from being supply-driven to demand-driven. Demand-driven being key stakeholders, being the board, the C-suite, the business unit executives, actually calling for assistance and help. So the objective-centric approach that we're helping companies implement, I just finished a workshop yesterday, and these workshops are requested by the heads of the business units, and they're designed to help them look at their absolutely most important objectives that they have to achieve. And the purpose of it is very much aligned with what Alex said. When I train facilitators, I make it very clear at the get-go, you're not going to add value by getting these people to see what they already know. You have to, through your interaction with the group, get them to see something they couldn't see without you, or see it in a different way. And I think that's extremely important to if the future of the risk profession isn't going to be pacifying regulators that have a narrow mindset about how it should be done. And unfortunately, I believe the regulators often, they keep literally legislating solutions that don't work. I have regularly criticized the SEC, and I've criticized COSO, The SEC said everybody has to report against COSO internal control for external reporting. Well, what evidence is there that it actually works? If I look a lot like COSO 2013 internal control, is there any evidence that suggests I'll actually produce more reliable financial statements? These are things the regulators have done with absolutely no evidence that would validate that enforcing and making people do things a particular way, whether it's risk registers or reporting against COSO 2013 or, God forbid, the earlier one, the 2002, that it actually is enhancing the performance that they seek. So I've been pushing very hard for the regulators to say, you know, look, if you're going to make things law, at least have the decency to go and verify that it actually works. And I'm open to be called wrong. Show me where there's any evidence that reporting, Sarbanes-Oxley reporting against COSO actually has resulted in more reliable financial statements. They don't have to do that in the UK. Does that mean that the UK has less reliable financial statements than the US? Because if you're listed in the US, you have to report against COSO. When the CEO and the CFO have to certify they have internal controls that are effective in accordance with COSO 2013. Don't have to do that in Britain. Is there any evidence publicly listed British companies are more dodgy or more wrong than US companies? What frustrates me is the regulators don't appear to care when they legislate requirements that cost society tens of billions, even hundreds of billions of dollars in compliance costs, with very little regard to whether they actually are accomplishing the societal purpose that they're trying to achieve. So, I'm with Alex, except I get very frustrated if Risk Management 1 is all about pacifying wrong-headed regulators. I think we have a very serious problem. So when we move to 2, I think it's going to be difficult in a corporate setting if there's a complete divergence between what 2 looks like and what 1 looks like when the company's got to actually do both. So my goal has been to convince the regulators that more right-headed solutions that actually increase value as well as have the potential to protect value and the things that regulators care about. So the methodologies, in my mind, you want them to be capable of value creation, but also capable of ensuring value preservation. And that's what the regulators should care about. Convincing the regulators that some of the things that the regulators in Canada, I had a very heated argument with OSFI, our Canadian regulator, because they're promoting 3 lines of defense. Well, show me where defense is going to drive national and economic value creation. We need a balance between offense and defense and value creation and value preservation. So when regulators all get behind something like 3 lines of defense, which is, not coincidentally, defensive, with no balance on the value creation side, and it casts internal audit and risk into very specific defensive roles, I think the regulators are creating an extreme problem for both the audit and the risk profession.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. I've used this. I'll actually dive in just to make this fun. You know, maybe one of the most detrimental things that's happened over the last decade was when people in writing the ISO standard decided to redefine the word risk to, you know, be this sort of neutral thing instead of downside only. And here's the reason why is the analogy I use. One of my friends here in Arizona is an architect, and he often tells me that a lot of architectural design is really about sort of light management. It's the way that light feels in a space. And, so again, how light feels in a space, he's doing light management. Now, when you're doing light management, by definition, you're doing darkness management. I mean, it's just inescapable. But just because when you're doing light management, you're also doing darkness management, architects didn't decide to redefine the word light to mean both. It's sort of a silly exercise. And I worry that that's actually part of the problem behind all of this is people are doing a lot of word thinking. They're trying to, use these words and definitions, and they get into, fine, whatever, who cares? In some ways, Norman, maybe this is yet another reason why we should just get rid of the word risk, because, but on the other hand, risk is pretty well defined. It's been defined for a really long time. In fact, at least when I went to school, you would talk about risk and what? Risk and reward, right? I mean, just like you talk about light and darkness, you talk about risk and reward. It's always been around. It's been around for more than 50 years, right? In terms of people using those terms. And so I almost wonder if trying to redefine the word risk is a problem, because if we hadn't, here's what we would be left with. We would say, just like forever, as we're, plotting our journey through life, there's risk and reward. What I think over the last, say, 50 years, especially in the decision-making sciences, Alex, and I know I'm only familiar with the U.S. school system, and in the U.S. school system, decision science is typical. I mean, it's just part of the business curriculum. You take decision sciences 101 and learn Monte Carlo and all these things. So it's been around for a long time, and you talk about risk and reward. Perhaps there's actually a lot of value in saying the following. And I'll also, now I'm going to put a board member hat on. I think about the software companies where I sit on the board. And when we bring someone in to deal with a risk, for example, information security, guess what I'm not counting on them to do? I'm not counting on them to come up with new and creative ways to interface with my customers. I'm bringing them in to deal with the bad stuff. I'm bringing them in to overwhelmingly deal with the downside. Do I want them to ignore the reward? Do I want them to be absent-minded? Do I want them to not have any clue what we're doing? Well, of course not. But I know that my chief customer officer isn't doing that negative thinking in quite as rigorous of a way. And going back to risk management 1, I also know that my chief customer officer doesn't know all the boxes that have to be checked, which even though everyone agrees there's probably some boxes there we don't want to worry about checking, you have to. Right, so I'm almost becoming a fan of saying, no, risk is the bad stuff, just like it always used to be. It's the bad stuff, and reward is the good stuff. And of course, in business and in life, we're trying to balance risk and reward. And as we're making decisions, what you're really trying to do is you're not trying to find a so-called balance equationally. You're actually trying to find areas where you see that there is less risk and more reward. You want to find those areas that are out of balance so that you can exploit them as a business person, as an artist, as whatever you're doing. You're actually trying to find those areas that are out of balance in the marketplace in order to do better than your competition. So yeah, I'm going to go on record and say, let's bring back risk meaning bad. I'm going to say, let's go back to the definition from 400 years ago. Let's be happy with it. Let's not try to redefine risk. Let's not redefine light. Let's not make those mistakes. Let's certainly redefine maybe what we do as risk managers, but let's not play word games with the marketplace. It seems real silly.
I don't think we really are. And if I may jump in, mainly because I have bad memory and I forget the points I have in my mind. It's interesting you say that. I'm probably the last person on the planet to care about definitions. I don't mind the current definition because I actually don't really care what the definition of risk is, because I know behind the actual decision science and behind integrating risk into decision making, there are very simple tools. And the actual practical tools, which are decision trees, sensitivity analysis, scenario analysis, and simulations, they all produce something amazing, something none of the traditional risk approaches do. They produce not a single value, but scenarios. They produce ranges. They define and represent risk not as a single point estimate, which is your likelihood times consequence, or likelihood times consequence times velocity, or some other nonsense that people usually come up with. They define risk uncertain as an uncertainty which has an effect on an objective or a decision. So I can look at the investment decision and see that the management is promising NPV of 100 million, but in fact NPV would fall somewhere within 60 to 80 or 60 to 150. I always look at risk and I make decisions on risk based on the distributions, on the ranges that are produced based on proper analysis. And that's why kind of I immediately got attached to this risk management, to the traditional decision sciences, because it appears the tools that they have been using for decades actually solve the biggest mystery risk management has. Because how can you represent uncertainty as a single point estimate when any risk can have multiple effects? Everything is interconnected. It's too complex to dumb down into just likelihood times consequence. And most proper scientific tools actually never had that problem, because they were always showing risk as a distribution, as a range, saying that in fact the change in legislation may have both a positive and a negative scenario effect on the decision or on the company. In fact, a new competitor may bring down prices, but may also increase the sales volume. It always gives you much more ammunition to think. And that's why I'm not against your proposal to, well, I'm actually, so while I'm thinking that, I've been hearing that for a while, but I've never realized just how radical Norman's proposal is to completely get rid of the risk. And maybe there's something behind it. Maybe that's the way to go. And yours proposal, Scott, is equally as plausible, because really, if it's easier for people to think and kind of go back to the grassroots of the tools that have been used in risk management for ages by thinking of risk as negative, since we kind of inherently do that anyway, and you've made a very good point about there's always been risk and reward, and that's why showing risk as a distribution makes so much sense, because you immediately see, yes, there are multiple scenarios that have positive outcomes and they will lead to much greater reward that we anticipate, and there are multiple scenarios that will lead to negative outcomes and that will be our risk. And the job of the risk manager to work with the decision makers to reshape the decision in the way to increase the likelihood of the positive outcomes and decrease the likelihood of the negative outcomes. But there will always be negative outcomes and there will always be positive outcomes. It's about kind of tipping that scale more into the positive side of the distribution, if that makes sense.
So let me jump in. Alex, I agree with a lot of what you just said. Scott, you brought out a really, really important couple of points here. First, yes, risk is generally perceived as something that you do, something that could happen, which has a negative effect on the organization, negative effect on your achievement of objectives. And one of the problems is that even when COSO initially started talking about risk and opportunity, and if you look at, for example, the King Code in South Africa, they moved from risk management to risk and opportunity management. Risk and reward. Okay, risk is negative, reward is the positive potential effects of what might happen on the organization on its achievement of objectives. But then you start talking about risk management, and all the people talking about risk management and writing standards and practicing risk management focus only on the negative. So when I write about why don't risk practitioners apply the same tools and disciplines to look at the possible reward side, they say, well, that's not my job. That's the strategy management people. I just look at the negative. And this has some really bad results, because all you end up with is a list of bad things that might happen and no analysis, no thought as to whether the reward justifies taking the risk. Not at all. And as Alex was started talking about, you've not only got a range of scenarios, a range of possibilities for the bad, you've got a range of possibilities for the good side, and you've got to figure out all of those potential consequences, which may happen over a period of years even, not all at the same time. So you've got to find a way to make an intelligent decision that considers all the things that could happen which are good and all the things that could happen that are bad. I happen to be writing a new book at the moment. I'm probably about 70% of the way through, looking at technology-related risk. And that has brought me into the world of ISO 27005, and which is focused mostly on cyber risk, information security risk, and NIST guidance. For those of you who don't know it, the NIST, forgotten exactly what it stands for. I know the rest of you will remind me what it is, but they're part of the U.S. Department of Commerce, and they have provided some pretty good guidance on how to assess the risk to information assets. Okay, all well and good, and the NIST guidance at the end makes this really important point that even though a risk, a cyber risk, may be identified as critical, that doesn't mean it shouldn't be taken. And somehow there's this huge gap, and NIST recognizes explicitly in its guidance, between understanding risk and its significance to information assets or to availability or whatever, and what is right for the business, and how people are making decisions in the boardroom and in the executive management suite. Because they need to be able to understand both the good and the bad consequences of, for example, you brought this up, Scott, cyber. Okay, do I invest in capital and resources to address cyber risk at the expense of new product development? That's a decision that somebody's got to make. How much money am I going to invest in cyber? If I cannot express all of these potential things that might happen, both the positive and the negative, in the same way, I can't balance them. I can't figure out whether the reward is greater, as you pointed out quite rightly, Scott, whether the reward is greater than the level of risk. I can't figure it out because they're using different scales, different measurement, and sometimes nobody's actually doing any kind of analysis on the positive side. Somebody just says, well, I think we can make $75 million additional profit and get an extra 5% of market share if we do this. And that's just a proposition. It's an intelligent guesstimate by marketing people, and yet the security and the compliance and the risk people are coming up with all these sophisticated tools to come up with the downside estimate. And somebody in management cannot figure out, because they're using different language even, do I go ahead or not? And so this is where I think you need to come back to, what are we trying to achieve as an organization? We're trying to make intelligent decisions, finding opportunities that exceed the level of risk, considering compliance risk and all the other kind of disruption that it could cause to the business, but make intelligent decisions considering all the things that might happen, both the good and the bad. And if we concentrate only on the R word, that is not going to come up with any constructive management to the organization. We've got to find a way to look at everything that might happen. And as Alex quite rightly said, there's a range of potential consequences on the bad, there's a range of potential consequences on the good, and somehow we've got to come up with the tools, the education. And sometimes it's a matter of asking, not only providing tools like Monte Carlo, but tools like telling people what questions to ask, such as, of the marketing people, what confidence level do you have that you're actually going to get this? What are the competitors doing? What opportunities are there actually to do more? And sometimes we just don't get that kind of question. And so I like the idea of Tim, you're asking the facilitators, training facilitators, hopefully to ask these questions. And this is what it comes down to, the intelligent. I talk about intelligent and informed decisions. Informed, understanding what might happen, but you've also got to have intelligence. They've got to be taking the time to think about what might happen and ask the right kind of questions.
Scott, I think your point about the notion of simplifying is an important one. What I have done for probably the last 25 years is the core laminate we use to teach objective-centric risk assessment. In the box, we have the objective, and then we talk about the internal and the external context being the world that the objective is going to be achieved in. And then the box, it says threats to achievement / risks. I have to use the word risks because the regulators like it, and we have all of this international community that uses the word risk. But my preference from a learning perspective is the term threats to achievement. And the reason that I chose that many, many years ago is that it forces people to always have in their head achievement of what? Well, that's an important objective, be it a positive one that's going to make the company great and top in the world in their class, or be it a simple one which is producing reliable financial statements or safeguarding critical confidential information, any of those things.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think, this idea of, again, risk and reward, it's been around forever. And I actually think, however, when we all talk about whether it's, called risk management 1 or 2, or if we get rid of labels and we say that there's certainly more sophisticated decision-making techniques that are addressing, whether it's balancing, but addressing risk and reward, there's certainly that. But I don't think we should pretend like there aren't, and I'm not suggesting any of you are pretending this at all, but I think this is important not to get lost. There are regulators, there are expectations, there are checklists, there are actually lists of things that need to be done. And boards of directors and C-suites, guess why they're hiring many so-called, risk-based experts? Again, when I put my board hat on and we hire an information security officer, I am not counting on them to create a new customer experience. And here's another thing I'm not counting on them to say, and this drives me insane. When they have the gall to walk into the C-suite or into the boardroom and then suddenly declare that information security is everyone's business. True enough, fine. Being friendly is everything is everyone's business to a certain degree. But risk-based professionals cannot forget that they have been hired to actually take on a point of view in the organization that management either is not particularly good at trying on, or they don't want to. They don't want to think about those things. And they're actually trying to have a team member that really is focused on those things. And I don't think that's bad.
Well,
I think it's
good. What we've tried to do, directly to your point, is we recommend that there be a value oversight committee, and they make decisions about what goes into what we call the objectives register. And so this is meant to be the top value creation as well as value preservation objectives. And we want that committee to decide how much help the owner sponsor gets, and if so, from who. So the owner sponsor has to report on the state of achievement of the objective. They can ask the risk group for training. They can ask the risk group for facilitating, or they can ignore them. The committee is also we task them with saying, do you want independent assurance on the information that comes from management? And if so, from who? They can say nobody, or they can say one of those people that you just named. I want assurance from the actuarial consulting firm that our underwriters are truthful and that it's all right, so that I can feel warm. Fair enough. Well, there's no ambiguity. They have identified that they want more assurance than management is giving them from somebody, and they have to identify the level of assurance they want. But the point is that we are really promoting the term value management and value oversight and trying to, it's not that risk goes away. You have to manage risk to create value, and you have to manage risk to protect value. And you may need help learning how to do that in a more structured way than what we all do intuitively. I just came up with a new set of labels for different levels of risk assessment rigor, and one of the labels is called intuitive experiential. That's the level that we just think about an objective and make a decision in our mind, are we okay or not? And if we're not okay, should we do something different or more? And that's really because you're thinking about risk. So that's intuitive experiential. And then we move up to the next level, which is, I called it time-limited risk focused. So we bang out a set of things that would threaten the achievement of the objective, and then consciously decide, are we okay, red, amber, or green on the 15 things? That's another level of rigor, still relatively low. Then we can move up higher and higher, and we want management to decide how much rigor do they and the board want on the certainty of achieving a particular objective. And we want that to come from management and the C-suite, not to be supply driven from audit and risk. So we're really trying to get the C-suite and the board to understand this is fundamentally about how much certainty do you want that you're going to achieve objectives, and make conscious decisions that will change the certainty of how certain you are. Now, you could have, you could just assign an objective to an owner sponsor who could be a fabulously intuitive, experiential manager who will see all the risks, intuitively manage them all, and do a fabulous job achieving them. No risk department, no audit department, nothing. They just are great, intuitive, experiential risk managers. However, there are others, and in large corporations, the objectives frequently warrant more structure to thinking through how much certainty do we need on a particular objective. And so that's the philosophy that we're trying to bring, is to make this a demand-driven activity focused around certainty of achieving objectives. And risk management plays a role in that. How much risk management and the level of sophistication, Alexi talks about high levels of sophistication. Those are great if they're warranted. And we don't want the risk department to decide if they're warranted. We want the C-suite and the board to decide if they want it. Now, of course, to explain that, we have to explain to them what it looks like and what value that it could bring. And then they make wise decisions about whether to bring it to plate or not.
I want to jump in here. Tim, I've got a lot of sympathy for your idea of objectives-based approach, and I think it does start with everybody actually understanding what the objectives of the enterprise are, which is a big issue all by itself. But I want to bring it back down to what I consider a fundamental point, which is that risk is not something you can manage once a quarter, once a month, or at an off-site workshop. You are managing the organization, trying to achieve success, trying to derive more value than taking the risk, than the potential for downside every minute of every day. And decisions have to be made. For example, Let's say that management is considering taking advantage of a new opportunity because of, say, a competitor's failing in Hungary. Okay, and so it's looking at both the possibilities of market share, the possibilities of perhaps new people coming on board with information and insight and technology for the product development side. But it's also looking at the other side, the negative. So for example, there could be additional compliance requirements, costs, and risks. There could be technology and cyber related risks. And somehow the organization needs to make a decision. Do I go forward? When do I go forward? What do I need to do before I am prepared to get everything started? So it needs to understand all these different things, including cyber risk. So coming back to your point, Scott, if my CISO, Chief Information Security Officer, just come back to me and says, oh my God, Transparency International and all the hacking reports are saying that we've got people in Hungary or in Poland, which is near, or Ukraine or whatever, are able to attack us more because they can come through Hungary. How do I balance that? How do I compare that? How do I factor that in to the opportunities that may be generated for me by going forward with a new operation in Hungary? And this is a decision that doesn't wait until I have my objectives register. This is a decision that I am making today. I'm deferring it for a while I'm making some further investments, putting some new procedures in place, maybe hiring some additional people, and then I'm continuing to revisit it until I go forward. And then even after I go forward, I'm continuing to make decisions as to whether I need to modify my strategies, whether I need to make further investments, whether I need to send executives in, whether I need to visit customers, and whether I need to spend more money on marketing and advertising. So these are decisions that are being made all the time. And we've got to get to the point where management is thinking about every decision it makes. Where am I? What am I trying to do? What happens if I do nothing? Will I achieve the objectives that I've set? Should I change those objectives and my strategies? What do I need to do? If I do this, what happens? Is that good or bad? Is there a better alternative? And this is not something that, going back, this is not something that's always been called risk management. I've been in my 20, 30 years in management at different companies, I've been in just so many meetings where the team will get together and they will just think through a proposal, a project potential. When are we going to go forward with bringing this particular product to market? What are we going to do with pricing changes? And they need to consider all of the different positives and negatives together. And this is not something that, sorry Tim, it's not something that can wait until I get all my executives together to do an analysis of objective races.
With respect, Norman, you don't understand my methodology because of the reason for facilitators is to basically embed a mindset into the work group so that they can do it without you. The goal of a facilitator should not be to be invaluable forever. It should be to get the group to think a certain way so that they can do exactly what you've described.
Tim, please. I'm not saying that what you're saying it doesn't have value. It does. Clearly it does. And it's similar to me to the Oversight strategy meetings and planning meetings that any organization will have on a regular basis. But we need to look at the decisions which are being made every single day. And those need to be intelligent, but they need to be informed and they need to be made intelligently. And this is where I think the tools that, again, Alex talked about needs to be applied many more times than in fact they are to both the positive reward side, the opportunity. How certain are we? What's the level of confidence we're going to actually achieve this? What do we need? What's the range of possibilities as well as the negative? And so if we only focus on risk, and this is where most of the risk managers are, this is my problem, they only apply their discipline to the negative They come up with a list of risks, and that does not help you run the business. And so you get board meetings where they have a discussion about risk, and they have a separate discussion about performance and strategy. That makes no sense at all. If you've got to look at how are we running the organization as a whole. And if the CISO is coming in and saying, not just everybody's business, because that's trite and this is obviously true, but if he comes in and says, we have a high risk, well, what does that mean? It doesn't mean anything to an executive. Alex will tell you stories of working with his managing director, where he comes up and says, this is a list of high risk. Well, that doesn't help me make decisions. That doesn't help me understand whether I should go ahead with this objective and strategy or defer until I can change something. And what do I need to change? We need the CISO to understand the business and come forward and say, if you go ahead with this initiative in Hungary, this is what you're exposing yourself to. And this is how, not only whether it's a high risk, but this is how it will affect the business. It could lead to the disclosure of your customer information publicly. It could disrupt your communication with customers. They could even perhaps bring your systems down so you can no longer bill your customers. So bringing that back down to, instead of technobabble, risk language or cybersecurity officer language, bring it back to the language of the business and say, this is the potential effect on the business and what you're trying to do and the effect on objectives. Go back to use that objectives list and the risks relating to it. Use that as a guidance in some ways to understand whether you should be taking that level of risk. Update it continuously. But we've got to drive intelligent risk-taking into the business every day.
And if my head is spinning because I wanted to respond to so many points, but I'll try and do it chronologically. I think something Norman just said is probably going to be the quintessential message of this whole discussion. And this is that's kind of been brewing in our minds all along, is that we are traditionally doing risk management when it's time to do risk management. And that, in my mind, is fundamentally wrong. We should be doing and thinking, maybe not call it risk management, we should be thinking about the risks, the downsides, the rewards, the potential impact that uncertainty has on objectives or decision at the time of making a decision. There's no point thinking about risks to the budget once the budget just been approved. I mean, sure, you can do something for the next quarter, but it's too late. Once the contract for a multi-million investment overseas has been signed, it's too late for the risk manager to run around and say, but the legal team forgot something important, and why are we absorbing so much risk, and the counterparty is not taking their fair share. It's just the time to think about risk is at the time of making a decision. And that has a huge implication on the profession, because decisions happen every single day, every second. Decisions don't happen once a quarter, they don't happen once a week, they don't happen semi-annually or annually. Decisions are constant, and that means the best risk manager can do is teach everyone how to think about risks when making a decision, plus be there himself for the most important decisions. Because there's probably a lot of quantification, a lot of modeling that needs to be done on the biggest, most important decisions. And the reality is, even in the finance team, they may not have the necessary skills to do all the modeling and do it quickly and accurately, plus fight the conflict of interest, internal conflict of interest, because they may be more reluctant to show the true picture. And same with investment team. They want the project to be approved. They don't want anybody to realize that there's actually a 3% chance of this project being successfully positive. So that's one point which I think Norman raised, which is absolutely critical. Maybe the future of risk management is thinking about risks when making a decision. And the scariest thing I heard executives say in the workshops that I do in CIS is, I've just signed a multi-million-dollar contract, where was your risk management? And of course, the risk manager was too busy preparing for his next quarterly risk workshop So he didn't have the time to speak to the decision makers when they were signing off on multi-million-dollar exposures. And the same, anyway, I can go on forever with examples. But something Tim said as well that really hit hard, especially here in the Russian and CIS market. Regulators are really doing us a lot of disservice in the risk space. I mean, I'm crazy enough to publicly fight most regulators in Russia, and they hate me passionately for it. But we have regulators that, despite all our pressure, all our attempts to block the legislation, they've published documents which require companies, force them almost, to have risk appetite statements and risk management framework documents, generate heat maps, risk registers, and produce quarterly risk reports. None of this was necessary, but they kind of continued pushing it. So we're both fighting it, and luckily, with some ministries and some agencies, we're actually influential enough to help them develop better guidance. For example, we've developed a maturity model for the Auditor General. So when they audit the ministries and the government agencies, they don't ask for a heat map and the risk register. They ask real questions about how decisions are made, how the budgets are approved, how the spending programs are calculated. Is it done with risk in mind or not? And same with Ministry of Economics. We've just helped them justify why they should block legislation which proposed a risk management standard for all of government in the country, which basically said you should do quarterly risk assessments and generate quarterly heat maps and then be satisfied with that. We helped to block that, and now we're helping them to completely rewrite the whole document so at least it asks the right questions. So there's a huge role that regulators play, and unfortunately they're not playing it that well. I mean, I've only seen Australian regulators being kind of semi-positive in that regard, because at least they are consistent. At least they're kind of playing the same tune as ISO 31000 is. In Russia, every regulator publishes something differently, different risk definitions, different risk management processes.
Stuff, right? From the very beginning, GRC has always weaved together performance management, risk management, and strategy. And the phrase we've always used from the beginning in order to achieve principal performance is you need to do all of this along with the existing rhythm of the business. Now, look, I mean, let's also admit there actually are decisions that only get made annually. You might even say, well, that's you shouldn't make them annually, but maybe they are made annually, whatever. I mean, if I'm running a coffee shop, I'm probably, 90% of my time, I'm kind of doing my thing, and especially if that's my mission, my vision is to own one coffee shop and serve customers great coffee. I'm sorry, maybe once a year I'll sort of really think, hard about some of the human conduct risk in my business or what might happen with the price of coffee. But in general, no, I'm not going to be doing it every single day. But point taken, the point is when you are making decisions to be able to factor this, this type of thinking, this style of thinking into the decision-making process, which I do think it's safe to say, most executives in business are not as in tune with some of this kind of decision-making, even if they took decision sciences 101 back in school. And I will say, when they're using these tools, oftentimes they're not doing that negative thinking. And that's why, again, I'll come back. I think one of the most detrimental things to our profession is this weird redefinition of risk. I'm sympathetic to the reason why it was done, but I am not sympathetic to the fact that it was done, and I think it might be causing more harm than good. And if we just kept using the phrases risk and reward, opportunity and threat, use normal language that everybody understands, and make the very forceful point that a good risk manager should manage risk and reward, right? Just like a good performance manager should manage reward and risk. I mean, can we agree that that's the name of the game? So, well, listen, we're just over an hour. I wanted to give each of you maybe a quick closing thought, and then we'll wrap things up. Tim?
Well, thanks, Scott. It's been a great discussion. I think your analysis that Norman and I are way more in sync than Norman might have implied in his remarks, I think is fundamentally true. I have believed for the last 30 years that when I go in and work with a client, one of my litmus tests is if I'm sitting in a cafeteria and they're a table two over are having a dialogue and I can see that they've increased the amount of consideration they've given to risk in their discussion about what to do, that means, in my mind, the tools and the training I'm giving is working. And whether that's at the C-suite table when they're talking over something and they say, you know, look, this decision is of such importance, we need to bring in the risk group to do a Monte Carlo simulation. Fabulous. Then they're starting to decide and make conscious decisions about rigor. So I think that's all good. I stick by my point that the future of the profession is from moving from supply-driven to demand-driven, and it's how we do that and how we make that happen. C-suites and boards that are intelligent and educated about the value that structured rigor can bring to an organization, they should be able to ask for it when they think they need it and the level that they think they need it at. Now, that may take some education to get to that point where boards and C-suites are very knowledgeable and asking for it. However, in my experience, when I work with clients frequently, the C-suite says, okay, well, let's go with low rigor. And the board says, well, wait a minute, we should have high rigor on everything. Well, no, you can't have high rigor on everything. It costs too much. So what we want is good logical discussion between the board and the C-suite on how much certainty they want certain things happen, whether they be the great things that are going to make the company first in its space or whether they're things that are going to drag it in the ditch like Wells Fargo. So, but we want to move from what is predominantly supply-driven internal audit and risk to demand-driven, where conscious decisions are made at the C-suite and board level about what they want and how much.
Great. Thanks, Tim. How about you, Norman? Closing thoughts.
Thank you, Scott. So I also want to set the record straight. I also have read Tim's methodology and he and I have had numerous discussions over the years. I do believe that what he espouses and practices and teaches adds value, and I'm not going to tell people otherwise. I look at it this way, and it comes back to another point, which is that in the eyes of many executives and board members, they see the risk function as a compliance activity. Where the profession needs to go, and I'm not talking about internal audit, I'm just talking about risk management or the management of risk. Those people who are charged with helping management should earn the reputation with management that says, I, Mr. CFO, Mr. CEO, Mr. CMO, COO, VP of this and that, believe that they are helping me run the business, make intelligent decisions and achieve success. And if and when the executive team believe that what is being done across the organization is helping them make intelligent and informed decisions, then we're doing the right thing. If all we're doing is doing a check the box, then okay, do that for as little funds as possible, little expense as possible, and realize that your risk function, that's all they're doing. But really, if you want to go to risk management 3, Alex, it's going to be where the risk officer is risk and reward, or reward and risk, or opportunity management, whatever you want to call it. But they are helping provide some clarity into the road ahead so that intelligent decisions can be made.
How about you, Alex? Last thoughts before we conclude.
Thanks, Scott. And thank you guys for having this debate. I mean, I always have fun when we chat. To summarize, and my thinking is, I kind of, over the last 14 years, which is really nothing in risk, but I've kind of come to the conclusion that the risk management one type activities don't really add and create a lot of value. They yet still have to be done. So I think it's kind of the moral obligation for a good risk manager to take care of those things himself and not bother and not waste management's time too much. Obviously, they still have to be aware, and because the risk manager is a good risk manager for himself as well, he would never finalize the document without getting some sort of commitment from the executives, because he wants to always come back and say, but this is the heat map that you saw and approved, even though I've completely created it based on your information. So anyway, that's a quick aside. Risk management one activities, hopefully, good risk managers out there will find the courage to do that stuff themselves and stop wasting and running ridiculous workshops on risk identification, assessment, and mitigation plans. And hopefully, hopefully those risk managers will find the courage enough to realize that risk registers with 50 and 60 columns, not rows, columns, are ridiculous and they shouldn't be done. And if it's just a risk management one activity, then a small risk register is just as good as a huge risk register, because nobody ever reads them and they're not used for any decision making. And hopefully those good risk managers, when they save so much time by not having to play along with this profanation that has been called risk management for ages, they will have the time and the courage finally to move more into the decision-making space and help out the executives at the time when those executives are making an important decision. And there are plenty of important decisions to help with. All the investment decisions, all the budgeting decisions, strategic decisions. There's really a lot of stuff where risk competencies can be quite useful. And exactly as you, Scott, pointed out, it's not like executives, even with MBA education, are that familiar with traditional decision sciences. It's not like we've created an amazing way to overcome cognitive biases. It's not like egos don't play a major role in decision making. It's not like corruption has disappeared in any country, despite what we see in the news. I mean, I grew up in Australia. I thought Australia was good because I then moved to Moscow and I realized how Moscow is just, darkness, corporate darkness in terms of corruption. But now we have every single Australian bank is being fined millions on some completely horrible activities that they've been doing. So no one is safe, and the reality that business ventures are just the way they've always been, and there's always space for risk managers to help with the decision makers when they are invited. But to be invited by executives to help with the decision making, they first have to take care of all the small stuff and be seen as somebody competent enough to help with the decision making. Because if your executives perceive the risk manager as somebody who can only draw 5x5 colored boxes, then they're not going to trust you with a strategic multi-billion-dollar investment decision or a strategic budgeting decision that requires a lot of hardcore competencies, and everything you've done up to now is just color-coded squares. Sure, it's not really a good enough sales proposition for the risk manager to be involved. So hopefully the listeners took away from today is that there are maybe more than one risk management, maybe two risk managers. They should ideally converge, but maybe they won't. Maybe the regulators are just too far behind and they've kind of lost the plot beyond recognition, despite the efforts that all of us are doing to change the regulators' perception on risk. Maybe we just kind of give up on the risk management one, hire a junior person to take care of that and focus on something that could be more valuable. And it's only valuable at the time of making a decision. That's kind of my final thought.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, guys. This has been, it's been fun for me. I'm sure for our audience today, it's been interesting to hear all of your thoughts. And until next time, everybody, keep staying tuned in and check out our webinar schedule. And hopefully we can do some more of these conversations in the future. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Scott.
Thank you. Bye.